he has been on the show before, and he's back. It's been about maybe a year ago, and it's Dr. George Walters-Sleyon, and he has a new book. So he wanted to come and tell us about his new book. And Dr. George, he delves into the deep matter of a subject. So his books are not like on the surface. He dives deep into the depths of whatever he's researching it, and he brings something out from what he discovers in his research. So Dr. George, welcome back to Black Authors Matter TV.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back.
It's a pleasure to have you. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Yeah, and Happy New Year. It's still January, so I can still say that.
Barely.
That's
Barely,
right. I
but
haven't seen you for quite a while.
no, quite a while. Quite a while. So your new book is called The Rush for Black Diamonds.
Yes, it
And do you have
is.
a copy of it handy that you can show us? The cover of, and the title makes me think it's about the diamond industry. That was
But
my
I'm
first
think
thought.
but I'm wondering if it's about something a little deeper.
It's about something else.
Yes, it
So,
is.
Well, talk to us about it.
So, uh, first of all, thank you for having me on. The Rush for Black Diamonds is it's a book on the transatlantic slave trade
Mm.
and its mutation into chattel slavery, and how the transatlantic slave trade changed into chattel slavery and then subsequently would change into penal slavery and what I call colonial slavery. But the book is also, whilst you have the economic argument for the justification of the transatlantic slave trade, the book delves into exploring the intellectual arguments and those who were the main proponents of justifying the transatlantic slave trade. Those were the philosophers. Because most of the time, when we think about the transatlantic slave trade, we first of all think about the profiteers and nations that are called the superpowers, which include Britain, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands,
mm,
France, Belgium.
mhm.
These are
Mhm.
the superpowers of the slave trade. We think about them immediately, but we often do not think about the philosophers that provided the intellectual justification that translated into uh, the emergence of laws, policies, economic theories, political theories to justify the slave trade. And so, volume one looks at two immediate individuals, John Locke and Thomas Jefferson. And Black diamonds is a metaphor for Black people, Africans, Black Africans specifically, because it is important to establish the fact that those who were enslaved were not light-skinned Africans. They were black-skinned Africans, particularly from West Africa, from parts of East Africa, okay, and South Africa, but black people. Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, there weren't really. Well, I don't know. I'm not. Is the anthropologist who studies the history of peoples? But during that time, well, that part of Africa, everybody's dark, pretty much, I think. But I'm not a historian or anthropologist like that. But That's a very good distinction. A lot of people, I know I had one, um, it was like a online conversation, but with a Caucasian person that didn't understand why Black people in America are different shades. They completely, now I don't know if it's willful blindness or they just never thought about it.
Probably never thought about it. I
Probably
don't think people think about the
how
dynamic
we got here, like
of,
we
right. They
didn't
don't think
pack.
about They don't think about that. That's not something that's on their mind every day. So that's why I think that some non-black people think we talk about it too much because this is a part of our existence. We think about this every day. We don't have the luxury to just la 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 through life and not think about why we got here or how we got here.
Yeah. So the different shades. Now, a lot of Enlightenment philosophers, prominent among them is the German philosopher George Hegel, actually divided Africa into three parts. North Africa, he refers to as Europe, part of Europe,
Hmm.
okay? And then East Africa, he compares to Asia. And then he refers to West Africa and Black Africa as proper Africa.
Mm,
You see,
Interesting.
proper Africa.
Okay.
So it's important to note that uh, and Europeans, when they went to Africa and with the emergence of the transatlantic slave trade, uh, they went particularly for Black Africans. You see, of course, there were North Africans, light-skinned Africans that they felt were part of Europe, and this would go back to part of the Rwanda Tutsi Hutus problem, where the Belgians got involved, and multiplied and did a lot of stuff in Congo in that area.
mhm.
But uh, but the book itself talks about different aspects of it. So yeah,
Hmm. Now, what made you go on this path? What made you decide? Because I know as a nonfiction writer myself, I'll observe some things and then I'll say, you know what, that would be a good subject for a book, but I may not have everything I need right now. But then the more I see and hear, then I keep taking notes and then I say, okay, it's time to write the book. So what made you like dive into that particular strain of information? What made you do the philosophers as opposed, because I know you isn't theology part of your training, your academic training?
yes. So I have my background is very interdisciplinary.
Okay.
My first and second masters from Boston University. I did philosophy, theology, religion, and social ethics. For my PhD work, I did criminology, criminal justice, ethics, philosophy, as well, and
Okay.
social theory, which I
Okay.
which I presently teach. But my immediate interest in this area came out of researching for my doing my research, my PhD research, and I began to explore different areas with respect to philosophy and its influence on Western consciousness, especially uh, individuals that are called the intellectual godfathers of the West, and the extent to which these intellectual godfathers of the West are still being read, and some of the things that they've written, particularly about Black people, uh, delving into them, you begin to explore uh, those things becoming very fundamental to the emergence of what is now called white supremacy,
Hmm.
because fundamental or associated with the argument about race and the justification of the transatlantic slave trade, you will have vis-a-vis the emergence of white supremacy as fundamental or central to that distinction between black and white. So I wanted to explore that and also to highlight the need for more understanding into the various strands of the transatlantic slave trade. Because most of the time, when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, we often don't look at chattel slavery. You see, chattel slavery become accidental. But it's important to note that the transatlantic slave trade gave birth also, whether concurrently, to chattel slavery. And chattel slavery continued well into the 20th century.
Okay.
You see,
So how are you defining chattel slavery for the audience?
Yeah, and
well, chattel
and
slavery,
while you're
Mhm.
talking about that, I want hopefully you can expand on how people see it as accidental.
well, chattel slavery, again, one, I want to be very clear. Chattel slavery, to some extent, is mutually inclusive and exclusive to the transatlantic slave trade. Chattel slavery became an institution of its own after the end of the transatlantic slave trade. But it came out of the transatlantic slave trade. It was the notion in which Black people were considered mere property and cattle,
Mhm.
okay, to be used as economic units,
Mhm.
Okay.
okay? Not only economic units, but subhumans,
Right.
okay? Subhumans and inferior to white folks. And to let you know, the first place, and I talk about it in the book, the first place where Black people were considered slaves and chattel property was in the British colony of Virginia.
Okay.
It was established in the Virginia law that Black people were subhumans, were cattle,
Yeah.
okay? Really established in the Virginia law.
Mhm. Yeah. From a philosophical standpoint, a person would have to create a rationale for treating Black people different from everyone else.
Well, of course. And so that's why you see in the book, I begin with John Locke. So
Okay.
John Locke is considered this a father of Western liberalism because of his emphasis on individual rights and individualism and individual property and private property and separation between church and state. But what a lot of people don't know is that John Locke's argument about private property was mainly about owning, first of all, owning Black people as property. Because John Locke himself was a slave master and a slave trader. John Locke worked with the British government and was a colonial officer in the Carolinas. You see, he was part of a group called Lord Proprietors and was a secretary for trade, the British trade, British colonial trade of the British Parliament. And he was paid, say. And so John Locke, in fact, would be the person to write the first constitution of the Carolina called the Fundamental Constitution of the Carolina. That constitution provides the foundation for the present Constitution of the Carolina and also influenced the American Constitution because John Locke then, his work would be appropriated by Thomas Jefferson.
Okay.
So
Now, what year was and I'm thinking that you would know off the top of your head. What year what year did slavery end in England? I know
in
it was
18
before it ended here.
in England, where in the British colony or the British Parliament ended slavery formally in 1833, 1834.
Okay. So it's
Okay.
mostly 30 years roughly
Yeah.
before.
However, though it was on the books that slavery ended in 1833, 1834, the British government informally tolerated the slave trade. So
Okay.
it continued well into the 1870s.
Hmm.
You see, so the ending of the slave trade by the British government in 1833 was basically, to a large extent, stopping slaves from coming into Britain, coming into Liverpool, Glasgow, uh, Bristol, those places. But slave trade continued in the British colonies in the Caribbean
Okay. And
and in
also, they
Africa
didn't
as
stop
well.
trading with the United States. They didn't,
No,
because of slavery. It didn't stop them from trading with America.
yes.
I
So,
think what's interesting though is that they may have traded, but they wanted to participate in the slave trade passively instead of aggressively, so that way they can say that they weren't really a part of it.
Yeah,
It
that's
was
what I.
easier to
That's
say
yeah,
that
yeah.
they weren't trading slaves, but if
Right,
they're participating passively, so they're still benefiting from it.
right. It's really like
yes,
you really are de facto supporting it. You're not participating directly. It's indirect participation, is what it was.
yeah.
So they
And
could
that was
feel
the
better.
problem.
Hmm.
Yeah. And that was the problem with the American government. After the British ended the slave trade, quote unquote, 1833, the American government or the Americans were still involved in the slave trade. Okay, formally and informally, you had the domestic slave trade, and then you had possibly the international slave trade still going on. The American flag became very important to protect American slave traders. You see, and so the British were saying to the Americans that your flag is providing a lot of support for the slave traders. So why don't we come to let us have a convention and put an end to this, and then we can control it so that your flag won't be used. And the American government and the president said no, because they knew that if the British controlled the end of the slave trade, they would get all the profit. You see, so indirectly, the British were saying we will control it and get all the economic benefits. And so the American government said, no, we want to continue to control it. And eventually, you had the Civil War.
Hmm. Okay. Now you go way back and you do a lot of research in terms of digging into details. Um,
Hmm.
what do you use for your sources? Do you use I mean, are there a lot of books written on that period, or are you the book writer on the period?
Well,
Or
there
a
are lots of,
combination of both, since you're a doctor?
oh, yes, there are lots of materials to access. And in fact, in the book, if you look at it, I have a very exhaustive bibliography at the back
Okay,
of the book. So part
okay,
of my goal was to for people to have this book here and do their own extra reading or extra research,
okay.
you see. So the book becomes a resource material that gives you a lot of extra materials for you to explore, you see. Now, I would like to also highlight, if you look, I have Du Bois and Douglas. So whilst on the one hand you have Thomas Jefferson, you have John Locke, and Thomas Jefferson, I call him the Lockean a disciple in the White House, because Thomas Jefferson will adopt, a lot of the claims of the theories of John Locke, especially with respect to uh, the separation of church and state. It was John Locke's argument, you see. And then Thomas Jefferson also was a slave trader from the House of Burgess and was involved in had a lot of slaves, Monticello,
Mhm.
Prominent among them is Sally Hemings. And
Yes.
in the book, I explore his relationship with Sally Hemings.
Mm.
And it's important to note for people to know that Sally Hemings was, in actual fact, Thomas Jefferson's sister-in-law. Okay, she was uh, Sally Hemings was Thomas Jefferson's wife's half sister.
Yeah.
You see, Sally Hemings was owned. Sally Hemings' mother was owned by Martha Wiley's. That's Jefferson's wife's father.
Okay. So, but
So
he
eventually,
didn't really
Sally Hem.
what did he recognize her as that? Probably not. Huh?
Oh, he knew. He
But I
knew.
mean, did he recognize her publicly as that? Like, was it a, she wasn't, like the fathers, the slave masters didn't recognize their own children as their children. In
Hmm.
most
Well,
cases,
yeah, that was
you
part of
know.
the Virginian law. She
Mhm.
was simply a slave. But in
Right.
actual fact, his wife knew that she was the daughter of her father,
Okay. Yeah.
you see, and Thomas Jefferson knew as well. But because you see, there was a Virginia law that said the white man could have affairs with his slave, and the child becomes not an emotional attachment, but simply a slave.
Right.
And so you had a
Property.
lot of white, yes, a
Mhm.
lot of white men doing it to increase the slave plantation. So in the book, I raised the argument of slave breeding
Mhm.
because Thomas Jefferson would go on to have 6 to 7 children by Sally Hemings.
Right.
But the only person that he really freed was one of the child, a daughter, that fled because Thomas Jefferson was selling all of his children. They were slaves, in spite of the fact that they were his children. But that's the thing about it.
Yeah, it's really a bizarre type of, I mean, it's almost
Well, there
unbelievable.
was a similar
You know
law.
what I mean?
There's a similar law in Louisiana. It's called Le Code Noir, the Black Code, where affluent white men were allowed, basically. I mean, it was well known that they had their white wife, but they also, and this wasn't to fund slavery though. This was, they were allowed to have
Have them.
a black concubine. And it
Mhm.
was well known that they had this black concubine. She wasn't allowed to, she had certain powers. She wasn't allowed to be with anybody else. He was hers. So in a way, she was still a slave to this man, even though she was considered free.
But Sally Hemings wasn't free. As a matter of
Right.
fact, when Thomas Jefferson died, he left Sally Hemings a slave.
Mm-hmm.
And it's believed that she was auctioned off after she had 6 children by him.
That's very sad.
Yeah. I did some history for my first book that I wrote about on group economics. And I mentioned in there that the first deadbeat dads were the slave owners because they had children that they didn't take care of. It's we talk about it in the modern times now with men who have children they don't take care of. But that's what was done 200 years ago, or maybe not 200, but you know what I'm saying. They
Well,
really would have offspring that they refuse to be financially responsible for, except for as slaves, which was really a minimum existence.
well, Dr. George, I have to share this comment in the chat right now from the Social Book Club. I wish he was my teacher. He makes you think and want to know more about our own history. So you are reaching a lot of people with this conversation tonight.
Well, thank you very much. Now, I said earlier, I want to talk a bit about W.E.B. Du Bois and Frederick Douglass.
Okay.
Now, first of all, I use the both of them to deconstruct the claims of uh, John Locke and Thomas Jefferson. In the book, particularly also John Locke would view Black people as subhumans. He makes a philosophical argument Okay. And so in the book, at the last chapter is, do you believe was Locke a racist? Is Locke a racist? But then I bring in all the claims that Locke provides for to establish or to argue for the inferiority of Black people as subhumans. Thomas Jefferson also in his most prominent book, The Notes, will talk about the intellectual inferiority of Black people. And just to let you know, Thomas Jefferson makes the argument that even if Black people are freed in the United States, they should be sent back to Africa. So this whole thing about back to Africa came from Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson hated any notion of interracial marriage, but yet and still he was having children by Sally Hemings. The inconsistency, contradiction is absolutely obvious. So in that, I use uh, Douglas and W.E.B. Du Bois to deconstruct some of those claims. So first
Mm.
of all, for Du Bois, if you read the book, the first chapter, access and reference Du Bois' PhD dissertation from Harvard, in which he talks about the suppression of the transatlantic slave trade. You see, so I provide a summary of it in relation to other materials as well. And then coming up in book two, I talk about Du Bois' epistemology, the extent to which, in fact, the phrase Black Diamonds comes from W.E.B. Du Bois. You see, so whilst on the one hand you have John Locke and Thomas Jefferson saying that Black people were inferior, you have Du Bois saying Black people are Black diamonds.
Mm.
You see,
Hmm.
not only economically, but not only economically, but also to establish the self-esteem of Black people. You
Okay.
see, so Du Bois would make that argument. Furthermore, I use Douglas. Douglas, if you read his works and you read particularly the 4th of July speech, he is uh, he's very particular about establishing his annoyance with white folks in the United States uh, on slave breeding. He said that's the most inhumane thing that white folks would breed Black people to sell them. And he
Mm-hmm.
talks about how uh, 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 the slave markets would pass by his house in Baltimore, and he will hear the wailing of these Black people that were on these chains carried from one place to be sold, you see, and Black babies to be sold. And so in the book, if I may,
Well, hold it up
volume
one more
one,
time because we are at the end of the show. So if you
okay.
can hold the book up one more time so people can see the cover and they can know where they can purchase the book, which is available. Where is the book available, Dr. George?
So book is The Rush for Black Diamonds, Volume 1. It's on Amazon. Okay, it's on Amazon. And you can also visit my website, which is georgewaltersleyon.com, www.georgewaltersleyon.com.
And
And you will find
I
my
did
other,
put your link in the chat.
thank you. And you will find my other books there too. Prison Chaplains on the Beat, uh, Locked Up and Locked Down about mass incarceration. Okay.
Okay.
And a book on poetry, Nuggets from the Night. Okay.
Okay.
And this one, my other book, God in the Name of
Name of
Jesus
Jesus Christ.
Christ.
And that was the book that you talked about the last time you were on the show. But we're at the very
Yes.
end. We're at the 9 o'clock hour, so we need to close our show out. We appreciate you. You have really schooled us and given us an education on what's in your books about the transatlantic slave trade, and we really appreciate you. And continue success with all of your work.
Yeah, thank you. And as we enter into Black History Month, I just want to say to everyone listening, purchase a copy of this book. Knowledge is power. We are on the verge of a lot of things, and anti-Black intellectual capacity has increased and is increasing.
Yes.
Please get resources this Black History Month. Purchase a copy of this book and other books on these issues and teach your people. If you're a pastor, a religious person, use these books to teach your people on Sunday morning. Education is power.
Okay, well,
Amen.
on that note, we're out of time. And good night, Dr. George.